NIST. There's been talk about kind of the concurrent workshops going on. This is kind of the bridge between the two.
Right.
Thank you, Shelly.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Shelly Bagchi. As Adam said, I'm at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So we're a federal lab in the US, working on standards and technology of all kinds. But yeah, we do have robotics. We are sort of focused on helping the US economy, I guess, generally, because we're part of the Department of Commerce. So our robotics is a little bit focused on manufacturing, but we're trying to be broadly applicable, especially with our HRI project. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about standards. Just one minute, guys. Try to hide the Zoom bars.
Do you know how to maximize that, Adam?
Oh, just to make my screen bigger.
I'm just going to hide them. Oh yeah, no, it's just the Zoom.
Okay.
The Zoom stuff sometimes it's like a black box on the screen.
Oh yeah, no, we can't see it,
Okay.
so you're good.
Yeah, so just to generally start with like what standards are, because the research community doesn't often like interact with standards. So they're usually documents that give you like specifications, test methods, metrics, performance requirements for like achieving a goal. And there's a lot of standards organizations that put out these documents, including ISO, International Standards Organization, or International Organizational Standards, if they like to switch it up, or IEEE, ASTM, they all make standards. NIST, where I work, we don't put out standards ourselves, but we participate in a lot of these committees through these organizations. And usually they're built by bringing together main stakeholders in an area, people from industry, people from academia, integrators, people who make equipment, and try to come to an agreement on what like the rules should be for whatever topic you're looking at. And standards are usually a voluntary thing unless a regulatory agency is enforcing them. But they can just generally help you conform to a common set of regulations. So we often run into problems getting people to implement standards because they're another set of requirements that someone has to follow. They don't often directly benefit people unless you have maybe customers that want a product that follows standards. And people often just don't understand why you might need a standard or what they're actually doing, because the documents are kind of like difficult to read and long and cost money to actually get to read. So sometimes we have trouble with that. So we're also trying to work to make standards a little bit more accessible. Some of what we're doing across the hall in that workshop. And then just generally getting people to actually participate in standards development can be difficult because it's kind of a volunteer thing that you do. But generally, we really appreciate getting input from people of all kinds of viewpoints to develop these things that would hopefully help the community. So in HRI, we see a need for standards in a few different ways. So we have issues with like lack of replicability, if I can say that word, in research, just generally. Not only do people just generally not try to replicate studies, it's often very hard to do that because the information is not there. Unless you go and like contact people, ask them for all the details of how they ran their studies. It's going to be hard to like look at a paper and exactly replicate what happened there. And just generally, researchers are all following different norms for how they conduct their studies, different procedures, especially between countries, since we're such an international community. And then how do we transfer the research outside the lab to the real world? That's a huge problem. And if we don't have the base research replicated and validated in multiple situations, can we even actually like take that research into the real world for industry to use? would industry have the confidence to apply new technology? So those kinds of things. And additionally, we think standards could help with people who are new to the community, like a brand new PhD student could look at, for example, a guide to running a user study in HRI and, have a baseline from what to go for. So we are working with IEEE on our HRI standards, two specific types of standards. I mean, they have standards that are actually called standards, and then they have recommended practices and guides. So in HRI is just so diverse that it's a little hard to enforce mandatory requirements under a standard. So we're also looking at recommended practices, which is sort of more of a recommendation on how you should do things. So it's not so strict. So we formed these two standards groups in 2020, late 2020. So they've been going for a bit. Actually, sorry, we formed a study group in 2020, and then in 2021 we formed the actual standards groups after running for a year to see that we had interest and a need for the standards. So we have two right now. We have IEEE P3107, which is trying to put together a standard terminology for HRI. So we run into problems where researchers are at different labs are defining things in different ways. So how do we kind of consolidate that, and what terms do we need to have definitions for that that would be important to have a consistent definitions, basically. So there's that, and then that's chaired by Jeremy Marvel at NIST. He's my boss. So yep. And then P3108 is the group that I'm chairing right now. It's a recommended practice for design of human subject studies. So this is just generally trying to provide what are the best practices and requirements that you need to execute a good human subject study, specifically for HRI, because there are different concerns compared to other types of user research. So we're trying to provide methodology that enables replicability, as well as like a skeleton design of experiments. So sort of a guide for how to run a good study, and how to report what you did in your study in a way that makes it replicable, and also just puts out the details that are usually missing from papers. So we have a lot of topics to cover in P3108. So we're trying to go through, like, how do you recruit your participants? What kind of demographics do you report about them? How do you handle them in an ethical manner? All the way from there to, like, how do you actually design the study? What kinds of, how do you group your participants? How do you design your methods? What kind of metrics do you collect, and how do you report them? How do you release your data? And yeah, there's a lot there. So if anyone is interested, we need a lot of help on all these topics. Something else we've worked on recently is a formalized way of reporting user studies and what you did. So that's another thing we're looking at to enable replication. So we're trying to create a form that's not officially standardized, but sort of like a formal format that you could use, for example, in like supplemental materials when you're writing a paper. There's not often a lot of space to include like every detail about the study. So the things that are like often removed, you could put into this sort of thing, and then people have access to it. And the goal is to make it sort of in a format that's machine readable, so meta studies could be easily done. And we could maybe create a database of studies in the future for people to go through and access more easily. So we're looking at the main topics of the group's focus, as I mentioned before. So the basics of the study design, how many variables do you have, how many groups, how are they organized, what were your hypotheses, did you pre-register them, all your demographics, your recruitment information, where to find your code or your data. So if you're interested in this, there's a link, there's a QR code. You're also presenting a paper on this on Thursday, 9 a.m. I think, in the LBR session. So look up yeah, we're looking for people for the community to come and join our standards groups because we need everyone's inputs to make something that fits, what kind of research everyone's doing. So we are having a meeting tomorrow at lunch in the Poseidon room, which I cannot tell you where that is right now. But it's somewhere. It's on the map. Yeah, so tomorrow at 12:30, bring your lunch and see what we're working on. And we normally, this is gonna be like our second in-person meeting ever, but normally we meet just online. And we have subgroups working on, different small topics that meet like once a month. So, yeah, I'll post the Slack link in the compare Slack. Yeah, all the Slacks. So I think that's pretty much it. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that this purpose or the structure is to set up the support commerce in the US. I'm wondering then, who are the people who are coming and asking you guys for HRI things first?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of trying to do this in like a forward-looking way based on like our experience with other standards. So a lot of my coworkers work on like robot safety standards and things that are like actually being used in industry. We're sort of coming at this in a way of like taking the HRI research and making it like ready for industry to use because we want to increase, collaborative robotics, like the potential of that in what industry is doing. So we think by like making this research more accessible to industry by making it stronger generally, that would be helpful. Does that answer your question?
Maybe tagging off of that question, have you had other industry stakeholders involved in some of these discussions that are, providing their inputs and kind of providing a good use case for like why you need it outside of academia research?
Yeah, I mean, we have a few people from industry, but it is like mainly academia focused. People from industry are often like, maybe a little bit secretive about how they're doing things. And also like user studies are a little bit different, I feel like, in industry compared to academia. So we're kind of trying to focus on like that one part right now. So we would love to get people's input from industry. I don't know if anyone here is from industry, but yeah, to get an idea of like what they look for if they're looking at research to implement.
That's what I was thinking. It's like, yeah, industry probably does have very different, even just internal standards of how they might run a user study compared to academia.
And do we want them to be more similar, or is it like,
Right.
should research continue the way it's going? Yeah, that's a lot to figure out. So, yeah, if anyone has knowledge about that or contacts in industry that work on user studies, it'd be great to hear.
So we've heard a couple times about experiment replicability, and that's something I'm particularly interested in. I actually was just on a paper that went to Eurosys, which is an operating systems conference, and there's very strong need for replicability. They wouldn't accept that paper until the reviewers could redo everything we did, including all the experiments. And
Wow,
exactly.
That's a fantastic critique, but wow, what a
lot of work.
Yeah, and we were, it was for changing the Linux operating system, so it's important. But beyond the Linux community, the reviewers wanted to ensure they could replicate everything. And so I'm wondering how we can, given the challenges of user studies and user interaction, how we can bring some sort of similar level of rigor to replicability in this space.
Yeah. So I mean, like the reporting form we're working on is kind of our first attempt at that. Just trying to make sure like all the information is there for someone to be able to replicate it, because right now, we're working on page limits. We can't include everything. Yeah, just trying to get people to report things. But I mean, replicating a user study takes like a long time, so it's also more of a commitment than more software-based work. So yeah, it's a hard problem. Don't really know.
I think there's a social component to this too, and that it has to be made desirable for everyone.
Yeah, definitely.
And the community can help with this by, in the systems world, the ACM artifacts, artifact track submissions that have these things, they'll get stamped, literally stamped in the ACM system, that the artifacts we kept track of, this is the standard review that was applied. And that kind of perpetuates that culture. And because we lack those mechanisms, right, there are papers that get stamped outside of the best paper award, right, that we know, oh, this was really carefully looked at, and that is the thing that is valued and desired. So I think there are things we can do socially to start that, that start at even lower levels of just make sure people want this.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe the question is, if you replicated a study, where would you publish a paper on that? Is there like a place right now where you could do that?
There are the R papers. Still don't really know how proliferated those are or how much people are aware of them.
Is it just through Robotics
just-
Automation Magazine, or are there other ones as well?
Yeah, that's the only one I'm aware of.
Okay.
Only in that it's like a effort that is being put out specifically for, this is made to be replicable. I don't know if they have actually versions of papers of like, I'm promoting something to be replicated, or here is an example of me replicating something
Oh,
to be relevant.
yeah. that would be interesting, but,
So last year we
Yeah.
tried for HRI to have this special track on replication,
Yeah,
and it
Because
was
we didn't get
replication and
many.
data sets. Most of the papers that got submitted were more on presenting data sets rather than and trying to replicate.
right.
But probably because there's no,
It's difficult. to
yeah, it's
replicate
really
studies,
difficult to
so-
replicate, and then there's no,
Why would you
there's no
do it?
opportunity.
No, I mean, like, if I'm running a lab and I'm spending, $100,000 a year per person, why am I gonna, put
Yeah,
that
to
person
do
on
new
trying to
research.
replicate someone else's research, right? I think it's,
Well, I think there are many reasons in terms especially of the social bit, like cultural differences and many things that we'll be talking about, like you maybe have done your study in one specific target population, but you want to see how does it replicate with another type of population. So everything should be the same, except for the different user
Yeah,
types that you're
probably a
having.
matter of clarifying what
So,
we mean by replication.
exactly.
Is
I
it
think
like,
it's more in terms of,
like getting
am I
robustness?
going to get the same results with this population compared to that one? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Why? Not in terms of getting the same results. Maybe at some point, maybe yes, that's interesting. But in any case, we did try that last year. We organized that, and this year I haven't seen it, so I don't
No, I
think
didn't
there
know
was
that.
any. It didn't really succeed
Yeah.
so far.
But like maybe you want to build out someone else's work and you replicate it like as a baseline, you can, count that towards something if you're able to successfully replicate it. And then later publish on something new that you add to it.
Also, I think it's like a funding situation as well, like if funding agencies would have funded groups to replicate the studies, to fact check or like to see that it really holds. I think that's one thing that is missing in HRI, and also a couple other human subject research fields that there's no like proper funding just through the replication study to see if it really holds.
Right,
across various
right.
groups.
There was recently published from an NSF Dear Colleague letter about replication, reproducibility. It's not a program centered around it, but they're like, we want to see this. But again, it's probably more around like, you should make things that are reproducible, not necessarily, we want to fund you to reproduce something,
Yeah.
because that's the other part of it.
If they don't know what to spend their own money, like, not getting news.
But see, and then it's an issue of like what we mean by new. Like, to me, it is a very important result. Say I replicated something and it actually was replicated with whatever 10% variation along this metric.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's probably not given the same value as here's this new endeavor.
We tried one year in the metrics workshop to like get proposals for studies people wanted to replicate.
Mhm.
We didn't get a whole lot of interest, so we might have funded some of them, but so I don't know. We need the proposal, I guess, first.
We need to get someone who works with NSF. Other questions or comments for Shelly?
We still have half an hour, actually.
Yeah, well, and we're going into discussion now too.
Okay.
So this is a good kind of way into it. So thank you, Shelly. That was great. Okay. So we have, about a half an hour between us and lunch.